Welcome to As the Story Grows. I'm Amanda Patton, filling in for Brian Patton, who is currently without a voice. Today, we welcome Jeremy Hunt back to the podcast. Jeremy recently released his debut book, From Chaos to Ambiguity, A Theology of Noise Rock. A link to the book will be in the show notes. Jeremy talks about deciding to form a theology around the sound of God and how noise rock intersected with that idea, choosing Oxbow and God Bullies as his centerpiece bands for the book, Noise as Resistance, and so much more. Thanks for listening to this episode of As the Story Grows. If you're new to the podcast, welcome. You can find links in the show notes for the podcast mailing list, our community on Discord, or you can support the show financially and get early access to every episode on Patreon. And make sure you never miss an episode by subscribing to the podcast on your podcast platform of choice. Enjoy today's conversation with Jeremy Hunt.
Was this your thesis, this book?
Yes, it was it was my dissertation with some edits.
Okay.
I think you're gonna laugh because the other day my girls were like, they were asking me something about it, and I said something. I made the mistake of being like, I wrote the book, I know it backwards and forwards, and my youngest, I think, was like, okay, so what's the very first word? I was like, I was like, okay, fine, maybe I don't know it. So I have it if I need to refer to it, but I think it was, to answer your question, it was my dissertation, and I think it was chapter 2, maybe sort of like the history. That was the one that changed the most from dissertation to publication, just because, excuse me, when I wrote it for the dissertation, I pulled, and they're still there, but I pulled from just a lot of oral histories that have been published. And in so doing, I just really wanted, at least in dissertation form, I was like, these are literal quotes from people who were there. Like, I could restate some of it. I could reframe some of it if I needed to, but I was like, it feels more powerful to me to have these voices just fully represented. And my advisor, to his credit, he was very supportive of that. But it's a different beast, when it comes to a book, and there's certain different. I'm guessing different publishers have different approaches, but mine at least was like, hey, for any given chapter, having like basic like block quotes and full on excerpts, you can only do like a certain percentage. The rest of it has to be, which I totally understood, but that was probably the biggest piece that had to change from that. But yeah, I really tried from the get-go to write it as accessibly as possible. Like I there was obviously no guarantee that I'd be able to publish it or find someone who wanted to publish it, but the sort of the long game there for me was like, let me just go ahead and do this in the tone and the style that I want it to eventually be in, so that it just saves me work in the long run. I mean, is that a common thing for people to take their dissertation and like try to publish it? Like, you've done the work, right? Right. Yeah. I mean, gosh, I think so. So for instance, one of my fellow seminarians, I mean, we had a few classes together, and she and I technically, like, we graduate, it's so weird because it's not like you have like a class year. Yeah. You're doing the work until you're done with it. But Tamisha, her name's, now Dr. Tamisha Tyler. She's an Octavia Butler scholar and did her work on some of Butler's writings. I think I haven't read her dissertation yet. Last I heard from her, I think she's working on a version of it for a book. Okay. But I think it also just depends on, potential audience, potential uses within a classroom as a textbook. I mean, there's a lot, obviously, that can go into it. And mine is, technical in a few aspects, but there are certainly folks that have written far more technical that probably become, what's the word I'm looking for? Not esoteric, but just a little bit more disconnected from a wider audience. Like you're really aiming for kind of a niche field, which is great. I mean, that's what you would hope, that somebody that spends the time that it takes to do this.
Yeah.
If you're whatever the topic, whatever the field that you're interested in, man, go deep and give us something that, for the folks that want to chew on this stuff.
Yeah.
They can really sink their teeth into. So
nice.
Yeah.
A Theology of Noise Rock. Talk to me about the inspiration and kind of what drew you to trying to create create's the right word, create this, kind of crossroads with your love and fandom of noise rock and theology.
Yeah.
The sound of God, right?
Yeah. I mean, it goes back. It's one of those things where now, being on the other side of it, I can kind of look back and see there is an actual through line for me in my life with this stuff, dating back to, and I think I allude to some of it at the very beginning of the book, of just I've always been fascinated and have a deep love of culture, as expressed through film, TV, books, literature, poetry, whatever the case may be. But because of the circles that I grew up in, sometimes that stuff was either completely forbidden or it was held at an arm's length. And so I think that I've always been somebody that's if you tell me something's off limits, I'm like, okay, well, but why?
Right.
It's just my natural bent to be
some of us are built that way, and we get in a lot of trouble.
Yeah. And I got in a lot of trouble growing up. So I think for me, if I sort of see that as the starting point, getting to seminary, doing the master's program, and then looking at, I should probably go for a PhD if I want to be able to teach at any level where I can sustain myself and my family, and probably best case scenario, make a second half of my career being in this work.
Yeah.
It's a big part of how sort of the Fuller School, but it also just it dovetails perfectly with my approach to these things, which is this stuff doesn't exist in a vacuum. These things don't exist in vacuums. They interplay, whether we identify them as such. They all bounce off of each other. I mean, we are, as individuals, we are complex, nuanced creatures that carry the background and the influence of everything that has shaped us with us. And so for me, it felt like a very natural thing to say, I love this art form. I participate in it as an artist. What would it mean to put it in conversation with all the faith and belief stuff that I've been wrestling with? So how do I, what might that look like? And to give credit where it's due, that sort of theology or a theology of is not a new thing. I've got friends that, again, like my advisor, Cutter Calloway, his background is theology and film. I think his dissertation was actually written on, gosh, I hope I'm getting this right, but I think it was actually film scores.
Yeah.
So I think he did some work on Pixar film scores and the way that it works, the interplay there. My other advisor, my second reader on this, Rob Johnston, is a legend really in the field of theology and culture. He's written multiple books on it. I think his dissertation years ago was on theology and play, or a theology of play. What does it mean to be playful and to have fun? And how do we put that in discussion with, questions of what we believe? So for me, in a lot of ways, I was really fortunate that those were the folks who surrounded me and were surrounding me during my time at Fuller. And then once I just sort of sat with it for a little while, I was like, oh yeah, this is the direction for me to move in.
Nice.
So, yeah.
That's cool. It's fascinating to like move into that field of like reading and thought, because like, as somebody who loves biblical scholarship, like that answers a lot of the questions that are off limits when you're in the church. You're like, what about this? And they go, you can't ask that. You go, well, why?
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
It's like, growing up, I probably tell my children too much stuff, but it's like, you can't just take everything you hear at face value.
Yeah.
Like, if people won't answer your questions, you have to find the answer somewhere, because
and to be, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, go ahead.
No, and being okay with, I don't know, being an answer. Mm-hmm. Like I'm not sure, or I wrestle with this, like that. I think that for me was one of the big sort of instigating factors of my trajectory on the faith side of things. Is I grew up in churches where it was like, well, women can only do this. Homosexuality is a sin. All these sort of the big things, the big topics. But then that attitude trickles down to smaller things, and you start, like, as I did, start asking questions, and it's either greeted with like, well, it's just the way that it is, or our doctrine says this, but you start posting that up against like other traditions or other parts of scripture, and you're like, well, this doesn't hold water. And if there's not room for further discussion and examination and unpacking and wrestling with these things, then this will sound really, really maybe prideful or arrogant. I was like, well, then I need to find another place. I need to find another space where these questions are okay, because this is not, you're telling me these things on this side of thing, but then I'm also seeing just what I'm experiencing in life and what my friends are experiencing and what my, like these don't add up. So there's a reality over here that I'm encountering, and you're telling me this. Something's got to give. Yeah. And I'm not here to, dehumanize or harm anyone. So where does the, supposed love of God that transcends all things, where does that find its place? In the structures you've put up over here that clearly don't show love to the people that I'm experiencing on this side. So yeah.
There's a thing you write early in the book. You relate it to film, how like the church kind of cuts itself off from like any film rated R is bad, and you can't watch that. And I recently wrote a blog post about like our films were okay as long as they were violent, because like that promotes this level of masculinity, and the violence was okay in Braveheart, but like somebody had to stand in front of the TV because there was a boob in the background, right? and like the absurdity of it all, like it's just like you just watched him get his head chopped off.
Right.
And this is like a thing like with music, hearing Sean Ingram talk about QOHELETH almost signing with Solid State Records. And it's like, we're one decision away from that being a band that was like approved by my parents versus now they're a band that's not approved by my parents because of the record label they're on.
Yeah.
And like, for real. When did that concept kind of come into your head? Was it just reading other people's work where you're just like, about finding God wherever, right? Even in things that might seem profane or big, because I mean, when COVID happened and I started running and getting sober, it's like the sun's going up. I'm listening to Hum and Shelter, and I'm like, God's here in this more than reading the Bible now. Right?
Yeah. Oh man, that's so good. Yeah. Gosh, I think some of it probably started for me. I mean, certainly those seeds were planted through those experiences, right? That I've mentioned, where it's just like, I don't understand. Like, I think I was fortunate enough that there were certain things that I was raised with about the Bible that I took literally. Like when you say God is love, and verses, is it in Romans, I think, where it talks about there's nothing that can separate us from the love of God. Neither height nor depth nor death itself. There's that whole list there. For whatever reason, my own personal makeup, just the way that I try to see and understand the world, I took those things as literal. I'm like, okay, if you tell me that God is love, and that's a defining characteristic of God, and over here you're telling me there's nothing that I can do to separate myself from that love, then there's a hell of a lot of freedom in that. There's, for me, almost like a bone deep security of like, not that I'm going to go off and, be a horrible person and still everything will be fine, but like these things that you're telling me this on the one hand, but then you're also being like, all of this is forbidden and verboten and it's scary and you can't participate. I'm like, well, that doesn't make sense. And so, on the music side of things, I think it was just that. I think it probably started happening when we moved overseas, when I was 17, and a sort of forced removal from sort of the American evangelical framework, and realizing like, one, there was probably a 6-month process of culture shock and not wanting to be there and hating life, coupled with like, I'm not part of a youth group. We're not going to a church. I say that I've, this entire time I've been a Christian. I say that I'm a Christian. I say that I believe, but it feels like prayers are like bouncing off the ceiling and going no further. And it was this season when I felt like, and I've had a few since then like this, where it's like, oh no, if I believe anything, it's got to be my own. Like this can't just be something that's been handed to me. That I believe just because my parents say that, we're Christians. So I think that for me was where things really started opening up, especially on the music side of things, where I was like, oh, I can encounter God in these spaces too. And music became just such a life-giving presence in that season. My listening habits were expanding. I was just exposed to stuff that sort of in the conservative Christian bubble that I grew up in I was maybe aware of, but I was not listening to. So I think that was when that shift really started happening. And from that point on, I was like, oh, I can be on the coast staring at the vast, expanse of the ocean and feel tiny and minuscule, and in that still feel some presence of the divine, of God, and I can be, ears deep, I guess, in some crazy album that feels transcendent because of what it's doing musically and technically and emotionally within me. I think that's probably where and when that shift started to happen for me.
There are two bands you really chose to focus in on this record to draw kind of the framework are Oxbow and God Bullies. Very different lyrical approaches and just music sonic approaches. Yeah. What was it about those two artists outside of just love for them where you related in a way that made sense for them to be the kind of driving motivator for your writing?
Yeah. I mean, I think some of it was... I think some of it was practical in the sense that they had enough there to chew on and to sort of interpret and wrestle with, that there was enough there for me to, spend 20 to 30 pages with each of them. Just from a real pragmatic standpoint.
Yeah.
Both of those bands have a depth of discography and a catalog where you can kind of look at, and this is sort of like the, right, getting into the cultural critique of what I try to do. There's enough there of sort of an arc of a career to say, okay, this is where they started, this is maybe where they ended up, and here's what we can kind of glean from them and pull out. Certainly, I don't think either of them would, I don't think there's any way in any sort of framework that either of them would be considered, Christian bands, but they're certainly spiritually minded. Mm-hmm. I mean, they're both of those bands are wrestling in their own ways with these, deeper topics. What it means to be human, what it means to be dehumanized, what it means to, grapple with these things. So, and I also felt like sonically, and you touched on it already, they represent very different aspects of the noise rock genre. So that was another appealing factor with both of them to say, hey, noise rock can contain multitudes, and it can sound like, God Bullies over here, and then it can sound like something entirely different with our stuff. So, yeah.
Yeah. There's a quote you share in the book, late in the book. The increase of noise in the modern world is a result of the subjugated masses refusing to be silenced, of the oppressed making noise about unjust power relationships. I mean, just for somebody who was a fan of a young age of heavy music, of chaotic music, people not getting it and wanting to shove you in a corner because they don't understand you. That makes sense. But also just looking around the world and kind of how we've treated people who protest for Black lives or gay lives versus people who fucking storm the Capitol. You could not ask for two opposite reactions. Yeah. Like, how much did the kind of social culture and what's happening in the world influence any bit of the theology aspect?
Yeah. Oh man, that's good. I mean, it was definitely an influence from the standpoint of once it feels like it's one of those things where once you kind of see or understand a thing, you can't unsee it. Mm-hmm. And so particularly when it comes to questions about like noise and the divisions that are either created by noise or the divisions that are created in the aftermath of noise, that really sort of captivated and shook me. I think that some of that stuff's pulled from, and again, I hope I don't butcher any names, but Paul Haggerty. Mm-hmm. His book on noise and sort of this philosophy of noise and approach to it. Once you're like, oh, wait a minute, there's a lineage here that goes back to, sort of the industrial age and the noise that's made in factories, the noise that's made from manufacturing, the noise that's made from, for lack of a better word, the common folk producing and making. Mm-hmm. And then it's the people that have the wealth and the resources that can separate themselves at a distance so that noise is no longer present to them versus the people that don't have that. That couldn't help but shift the way that I think about and understand some of these things. So yeah, it's and then fast forward to today, like I didn't get a chance to unpack this, and I don't think I even brought it up in the book because I didn't want to bring it up if I couldn't do justice to it. But you see news headlines about certain cities using either noise or chaotic, classical compositions as basically crowd control. Mm-hmm. There are some stories that I came across over the years, working on this and doing research of, corporate buildings that don't want to have homeless people right outside. They're blasting music to drive them away. And so it really gets into this space of it's not that everything is necessarily political or weaponized, but it absolutely can be. And there's layers to wrestle with and to sit with this stuff. And so to your point about Black Lives Matter and other demonstrations and protests and pushing for greater recognition of suffering or trauma or just basic human rights. That's where like the liberation theology piece of this really kicked in for me, where I was like, oh, this is part and parcel of that work. Like these things go hand in hand, and hopefully we become, it's what I get at towards the end of the book is like, hopefully one of the best case scenarios is that we walk away from this knowledge being more humanized, being more empathetic, and being more sensitive to the plight of others and what they're facing. So, yeah.
It's like tying that in with like, you shared the story of Sun Kim and her experience of just like, even as a deaf person, being aware that her noise was impactful to others and she needed to be quiet as a deaf person. And it's just like, man, like internal. I'm also currently reading Amy Kenny's My Body Is Not Your Prayer Request about how awful the church treats disabled people. So that coupled together, it's just like, man, like, the way you can just separate people out as lesser than, it's like, it's so messed up. In the same way you compare it to like the high art, low art, right? And just like, even people who look at like, you can have two songs. If one's a lesser quality, that's not as good. We can't focus or feature that, right? Like,
right. Well, and some of it too is like, not to excuse certain behavior, but there is an aspect of it too where it's like you sometimes just don't know what you don't know. I mean, we all come from our own, maybe not individualized, but we all come from our different backgrounds and our perspectives, and we all have these expectations of the way the world is supposed to work and the way things function, and I recognize that even in doing this, there's a certain level of privilege that I have, that I was able to go back to school, that I was able to work full time while I was in school to support my family, that my family was supportive. Like there's numerous things where it's like, so much of it I think is just being willing to take stock of who we are and where we're at, the locations that we occupy, and then saying, okay, what can I do with these things that I've been given, with these things that I have, to better see the people around me. And not that you're going to be able to put yourself in everyone's shoes and all that, but just like, man, there's got to be a way for us to, just increase that empathy for one another, and to, in some ways, I think sometimes just believe people when they tell us what it is that they're struggling and what they're facing.
Yeah.
I think sometimes we are so quick, if it's not part of our lived experience, we're really quick to write off, oh, well, that's not really that big of a deal, right? I mean, you can deal with this, that kind of thing. And and I think even that in and of itself can be a form of, even if it's unintended, a certain form of violence that we commit against one another.
Yeah. One of my favorite things about this book, and I've never seen it anywhere, is at the beginning of each chapter, you have a QR code with a playlist.
Yeah.
What gave you that inspiration, and kind of how difficult was that to work with the publisher, just the logistics of including music as part of this book?
So to answer the second part of that first, they were great. I mean, I kind of early on in the process with the submission and kind of showing them what I intended, that was never, I'm trying to remember if it was ever a sticking point. I don't think it was. I think they were just like, okay, sure, if you want to include that, let's do it. And it was more on the, getting into the nitty gritty side of publishing. It was just when it came time for that, along with the other pictures and stuff, the art that's in the book, it was literally just going through like JPEG 1, JPEG 2, like making sure I had everything properly delineated with like, this goes here, and just making sure. But no, they were great with it. I'm trying to remember when the idea hit. I think it was just as creative as I could get as creative as I could get towards a solution of like, I'm talking about music. Whether somebody listens to this while they're reading is one question, but they need to be able to hear this.
Yeah.
And so that's really what it came down to. Is I was like, okay, how can I give them some sort of a entry point? And so, just the idea of like, I mean, if I'm reading, most everybody's got their phone in one hand anyway. So why not give them something that they can literally scan and jump in if they want to? So
yeah.
But that was definitely a lot of fun, and it also gave me an opportunity. I mean, having read it, there's so many other things to explore with this. Like, there's so many, and I mean, bands. I talk about how obviously the focus, for the sake of clarity and being as concise as possible, is on U.S. noise rock bands, but there's so many other bands around the world that deserve attention as well. So I think, especially with maybe the first couple of chapters, that was an opportunity to at least sonically kind of expand the scope a bit, so I could include bands that I didn't have the time at this point to explore in a textual manner.
Yeah. Now that you've got the first one down, writing a book is hard work. It takes a lot of research, a lot of work. Do you want to follow it up and continue down this path, or is it like happy to have the first one out and you're just the work is for somebody else to do now?
Right. That's funny. I don't know. I don't. Yeah, there's a part of this where I'm like, one, I never thought I'd write a book. Two, it's finally done. And there's a piece of it, where I'm just like, okay, I'm good. But if I'm being honest, like I was talking to my buddy Gus here the other day. He's the main driving force behind Power Takeoff, who I absolutely love. I've loved his music for years. He lives, like maybe 15 minutes down the road from me. He's somebody that has truly lived a lot of what's in here in terms of a musician, in terms of knowing just people. He's from North Carolina, lived in Kansas, spent some time out in Washington, I think. He's a total gearhead. So like when people come through this area, he's either fixing gear for them or loaning gear out. So like when Sun came through, I think, and played in Asheville, like he provided like a major portion of like their back line, which is obviously for a band like Sun is a huge ordeal.
Yeah.
But I mentioned Gus because the other day we were texting and just talking about this stuff, and we were talking about the book a little bit. Like, I would love to do some sort of an oral history with Gus because he has so many stories. And so, there's a piece of it where I'm like, okay, I'm done. I'm good. I've done what I can, or I've done a piece of what I can. But legitimately, I'm like, man, there's more stuff to explore. There's more people to talk to. I think my biggest hope would be if someone who has the wherewithal and the inclination, reads this as like, oh, but what about, fill in the blank.
Yeah.
Whether it's a band or a scene or a part of the world, I would hope that they would feel, sort of empowered and gently nudged by this to be like, yeah, go write about that. Like, let's keep this conversation going. Let's keep this exploration happening because there's so much. I mean, we go deep into all these different bands, and you could probably, each of us could spend the rest of our lives trying to write and talk about this stuff. And so there's that aspect too, where maybe not tomorrow, but there's a piece of it where I'm like, yeah, maybe I'll get back into figuring out what a follow-up would be, or just taking what I've learned through this process and applying it to another approach with another book. I don't know. We'll see.
Yeah. I can't have you on without talking about music. You might not have put out a lot last year, but you were busy. Philip K. Dick had 5 different releases, the Noise Fest, H.R. Geiger Counter. Kind of what is the future? I know you've been working on stuff for QOHELETH. You're always messing around with something, right?
Yeah. I think there's always stuff percolating. I think the most concrete stuff right now is I'm working on I think, what can I talk about? I'm working on slowly assembling a follow-up release for Territorial Pissants, which is one of the Noise Feast bands, one of the QOHELETH spinoffs. That's basically kind of like a secondary solo project at this point. I've reached out to a friend here locally to see if he might be interested in helping me make it maybe a live band where we could actually do some stuff. Locally, which would be an absolute blast. And then slowly but surely starting to tiptoe doing maybe a follow-up to the H.R. Geiger Counter, which is really exciting because that's a collab with my friend Andrew. He's based in the UK and part of the band QOHELETH, which for folks that are not familiar with them, they're like an incredible like noise hardcore metal band that a lot of their stuff is improvised, which is just incredible. So it's a real joy to collab with Andrew. So I would say those are the 2 things that right now are most concretely in the works. And then actually on the label side of things, trying to map out first few releases for 2025. So I've got probably 2 to 4 things with different bands and different artists confirmed. So, I mean, confirmed in the sense that like we're gonna work together and get something out. So, on that side of things, I'm really trying to be as consistent as I can. Of like, I'm proud of the releases, including yours, as you are well aware of the Echo Broke Alone. Like, I'm so stoked on the batch of releases that I was able to get out this year, and stuff that I was able to work on. So I really want to be as consistent as I can be on that front. Like I feel like I'm in a good groove with my own personal stuff that I really just want to get better at promoting and releasing, folks who I admire, friends, through the label. So I'd say that's a big focus for me. For 2025 is just continuing to grow that and nurture it as best I can.
I think this is a personal conversation you and I had, not when we had on the podcast, but like you made the switch at the label from cassettes to more CDs, which was just economical, and kind of that cassette boom came and crashed a little bit. Like for indie labels, the real indie labels anyways. Like, I mean, have you seen kind of that same enthusiasm for CDs, or is it just kind of you're just trying to provide that physical thing for people who are into it because you like doing weird physical stuff anyways, right?
I would say it's kind of it's more the latter than the former. I mean, certainly earlier in the year when or tail end of last year, some of the releases that were put out on CD, to your point exactly, some of it was an economic thing of like, okay, tapes are not exorbitant, but I was like, I just don't know if I can, justify that cost like up front with no guarantee of sales, which, that's fine. I mean, it's not like I do any of this with the sense of like, oh, these have to sell out. Like it's, it's a matter of love and passion for me. But no, I mean, I think at this point, part of it too was also the tape company that I had used for the first few years of the label, like just went out of business, and
they all did.
And so that was part of it. Was like, okay, once things stabilize on this front, and I can get a sense of who's actually still providing tapes and doing this, then maybe I can get back into it. And that's basically kind of what happened with the releases this year, including yours. Was discussion CD versus tape. Does it matter? Do you have a preference? And then also, I can actually get tapes at a decent cost. And then, obviously I cut as much savings as I can, just dubbing them myself and doing, the artwork, and layout and stuff here. So, yeah. So appreciative to you and to everybody, early here at the front end that's checked out the book. It's really meant the world. I would say they're both similar in the sense, putting a book out is similar to putting music out in the sense of like you create what resonates with you and what matters to you, and then you release it with the hopes that maybe you'll find other people on that same wavelength. And I have no delusions of grandeur, but I am deeply touched already by the feedback that I've gotten from folks, you included, of just people either, spending the money to buy the book, spending the money to buy the book, and then reading the whole gamut of like, I'm just really, really grateful. So, and I've told folks this too. So for anyone that might hear this and checks it out, I would love to hear back from people. Like I would love to get people's feedback, especially, or maybe not especially, but even if, they disagree with something like that, like I really did approach this from a standpoint of like, how can we start having a dialogue and a conversation about these things? How can we open up the paths of communication with this, as niche as it is? There's a lot of, I think, applications that could go elsewhere. And so that would probably be even more so than like sales or anything like that. Like just to hear back from people like, oh, this inspired me to go and check this out. Or I like this part. I didn't like this part. Okay, well, cool. Tell me, what did I miss? Where did I, maybe go awry in one direction or another? Because this is not similar to music. This is not the end of the discussion. It's the beginning of it, hopefully. It's
a thought experiment, basically, right? Like it's like, what if we created this thing? Like, what does it look like?
Right, 100%.
It's not even here's the definitive be all end all. It's just what if? I think there's just hopefully a lot of freedom in that, and I hope it's a life-giving thing for folks as well. So